Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we journey through the life of Rexxar, the legendary beastmaster who became champion of the Horde. His is a tale of isolation and belonging, of betrayal and redemption, of a half-breed warrior who found his truest companions not among his own kind, but in the beasts of the wild. Settle in, get comfortable, and let this tale of the wilderness unfold before you. In the harsh and unforgiving lands of Draenor, before the world was shattered into the broken realm known as Outland, there existed a people who belonged fully to neither of the races from which they descended. They were the Mok'Nathal, the sons of Nath, a clan of half-ogre, half-orc hybrids whose very existence was a testament to the complex and often brutal history of that savage world. The origins of the Mok'Nathal were rooted in suffering. They had not come into being through love or willing union, but through the cruelty of the Bladespire ogres, who had enslaved orc women and forced them to bear children of mixed blood. These children, born of violence, were seen as useful tools by their ogre masters, combining the cunning and endurance of orcs with the raw physical power of ogres. They were bred to serve, to fight, to die at their master's command. The Bladespire ogres were particularly brutal masters, even by the harsh standards of Draenor. They viewed the Mok'Nathal not as people, but as property, as livestock to be used and discarded as circumstances required. Half-breed children who showed promise were trained for combat, forced to fight in the gladiatorial pits that the ogres used for entertainment. Those who proved useful survived. Those who did not were disposed of without ceremony or regret. Generation after generation, the Mok'Nathal endured this existence. They were not permitted to have families of their own choosing, not allowed to form bonds that might interfere with their duties. They were kept separate from one another as much as possible, the ogres understanding instinctively that unity among slaves was dangerous. A single half-breed was easy to control. A group of them acting together was a threat. But even the most thorough oppression cannot completely extinguish the flame of hope. In secret, the Mok'Nathal began to develop their own culture, their own traditions, passed down in whispers from parent to child when the ogres were not watching. They created a language of gestures and subtle expressions that allowed them to communicate without their master's knowledge. They preserved stories of freedom, of a world beyond the walls of their servitude. But slavery could not break the spirit of those who yearned for freedom. Among the Mok'Nathal, there arose a leader named Leoroxx, a warrior of immense strength and greater wisdom. Leoroxx was born into bondage like all his people, but from his earliest years, he showed qualities that set him apart. He was stronger than the other half-breeds, faster and more cunning, but it was his mind that truly distinguished him. Leoroxx watched and learned. He studied the ways of the Bladespire ogres, noting their weaknesses and their patterns of behavior. He observed how they organized their society, how power flowed from the imperator down through the various ranks of ogre nobility. He noted which guards were lazy and which were vigilant, which passages were watched and which were ignored. Most importantly, Leoroxx understood that his people could never be truly free as long as the Bladespire ogres held power over them. Freedom would not be given, it would have to be taken. And to take it, the Mok'Nathal would need allies, would need to be more than just escaped slaves fleeing into the wilderness. He began to plan, to organize, to prepare for the day when the chains would finally be broken. That day came when Leoroxx made contact with the orcs of Frostfire Ridge, specifically with their chieftain Garrod of the Frostwolf clan. Garrod was a leader who valued honor above all things, and when he learned that the Mok'Nathal were not willing servants, but slaves, he was moved to action. An alliance was forged between the orcs and the half-breeds, united by a common purpose, the destruction of the Bladespire clan. The Battle of Bladespire was a moment of liberation that would be remembered for generations. The attack was carefully coordinated, planned over months of secret communication between Leoroxx and the Frostwolf scouts who had infiltrated the region. They chose their moment with care, waiting for a festival when the ogres would be drunk and distracted, their attention focused on the entertainments rather than on their slaves. As Garrod's forces attacked from without, striking at the gates with a ferocity that caught the ogres completely off guard, Leoroxx incited rebellion from within. He had spread the word through the secret language of the Mok'Nathal, and when the signal came, every half-breed in the fortress turned against their masters. Tools became weapons, chains became garrots, and the slaves who had served for generations became the instruments of their oppressors' destruction. The fighting was brutal and bloody, as all conflicts on Draenor tended to be, but the outcome was never in doubt once the Mok'Nathal rose up as one. The ogres, for all their strength, had grown complacent in their dominance. They had forgotten that the half-breeds they commanded were warriors in their own right, trained by the ogres themselves in the arts of combat. Now that training was turned against them, and they paid the price for their arrogance. Through the chaos of battle, Leoroxx fought his way toward the heart of the fortress. He had a specific target in mind, a personal score to settle that went beyond the general liberation of his people. Imperator Kelgrok had been the architect of the Mok'Nathal's suffering, had personally overseen the breeding programs that had created generations of half-breeds, had taken pleasure in the humiliation and degradation of those he considered less than animals. Leoroxx found the Imperator in his throne room, surrounded by his personal guard. The ogre ruler was drunk, as Leoroxx had anticipated, but still dangerous. He rose from his throne with a roar of rage, grabbing a massive war club that had crushed the skulls of countless opponents over the years. The battle between them was fierce. Kelgrok was larger, stronger, more experienced in single combat. But Leoroxx fought with a fury that the Imperator could not match, the accumulated rage of a lifetime of servitude fueling every blow. Again and again, the half-breed warrior pressed forward, taking wounds that would have felled lesser beings, refusing to fall, refusing to submit. In the end, Leoroxx's rage gave him strength beyond even his considerable natural abilities. He seized Kelgrok by the throat, lifting the massive ogre off his feet through sheer force of will. With his other hand, he grabbed the chains that still dangled from his own wrists, the chains that he had worn since childhood. He wrapped them around the Imperator's neck and pulled, his muscles straining, his eyes burning with hatred. Kelgrok's death was slow and painful, exactly as Leoroxx had intended. The Imperator who had enslaved generations of Mok'Nathal was strangled with the very chains of their slavery, a symbolic act that marked the end of their bondage. When it was done, when the light finally faded from Kelgrok's eyes, Leoroxx threw the body aside and stood alone in the ruined throne room, the chains still clutched in his hands. Victory came at a terrible cost. Many Mok'Nathal had died in the fighting, brave warriors who had given their lives for the dream of freedom. The numbers of the half-breeds, never large to begin with, were reduced to a mere handful. Of the hundreds who had served the Bladespire ogres, only a few dozen survived to see the dawn of their liberation. Garrod, honoring the alliance that had been forged, offered Leoroxx and his people land in Frostfire Ridge, a place where they could live among the orcs as equals. The Frostwolf chieftain had been impressed by the courage of the Mok'Nathal, by their willingness to fight and die for their freedom. He saw in them kindred spirits, warriors who valued honor and loyalty above all else. But Leoroxx, wise in the ways of the world, declined the offer. He knew that the half-breeds would never truly be accepted by the orcs, that they would always be seen as something other, something less. The prejudices that divided the races of Draenor ran too deep to be overcome by a single battle, however glorious. The Mok'Nathal needed a place of their own, away from those who would judge them for the circumstances of their birth. The clan settled in a remote corner of Gorgrond, a harsh land of primordial forests and dangerous beasts. The region was known for its towering mushrooms and ancient plant life, forests that seemed to pulse with their own primal energy. Massive creatures roamed the wilderness, predators that would challenge even the strongest warrior. It was not an easy place to live, but the Mok'Nathal were a hardy people, shaped by generations of hardship, and they made it their home. Under Leoroxx's leadership, they built a village hidden from the sight of outsiders. They constructed their homes to blend with the natural landscape, using techniques that made them all but invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. The paths to the village were deliberately confusing, designed to lose any pursuer in the tangled wilderness of Gorgrond. The philosophy that Leoroxx established for his people was born from hard experience. They had spent generations fighting and dying at the command of others. Now they would fight only when absolutely necessary, only to defend themselves and their home. They would not seek conflict with the other races of Draenor, would not involve themselves in the wars and feuds that constantly erupted across the savage world. Isolation became the cornerstone of Mok'Nathal society. They traded with the outside world only rarely, only when absolute necessity demanded it. They kept to themselves, maintaining their hidden village, raising their children to value peace and self-sufficiency above all else. The world beyond their borders was dangerous, filled with those who would see them as monsters or slaves. Better to avoid it entirely than to risk the suffering that engagement would surely bring. This philosophy served the Mok'Nathal well in the years that followed. While the orcish clans warred against each other and against the Draenei, while the ogre empires rose and fell, the half-breeds remained safe in their hidden corner of Gorgrond. They watched the chaos from afar, grateful that they were not part of it, confident that Leoroxx's wisdom had saved them from destruction. It was in this hidden village, several years after the clan's settlement in Gorgrond, that Rexxar was born. The birth was difficult, as births often were for the Mok'Nathal. The child was large, larger even than most half-breed infants, and his mother labored for many hours before he finally emerged into the world. But emerge he did, screaming with a voice that seemed impossibly loud for so small a creature. The child who would one day become champion of the Horde entered the world as all Mok'Nathal did, bearing the marks of two races in his towering frame and powerful build. Even as an infant, his size was remarkable, suggesting the warrior he would eventually become. His mother saw in him the potential for greatness, a destiny that went beyond the quiet life of the village. His father, Leoroxx, saw something else, a son who would need careful guidance if he was to survive in a world that would never fully accept him. The chieftain had seen too many promising young warriors fall to the temptations of the outside world. He had watched as Mok'Nathal youth, chafing under the restrictions of village life, had ventured out into Draenor and never returned. Some had been killed by the dangers of the wilderness. Others had been captured and enslaved by those who saw half-breeds as useful commodities. Leoroxx was determined that his son would not share their fate. From his earliest years, Rexxar showed signs of the warrior he would become. He was larger than the other children of the village, stronger and faster, with an instinctive understanding of combat that seemed to come to him as naturally as breathing. When the elder warriors demonstrated fighting techniques, young Rexxar absorbed them with uncanny ease, his body seeming to know the movements before his mind could fully comprehend them. But it was not his martial abilities that truly set him apart. It was his connection to the beasts of the wild. From the time he could walk, Rexxar was drawn to the creatures that lived in the forests and caves surrounding the village. He would toddle away from his mother's watchful eye, invariably found hours later sitting peacefully among animals that should have been dangerous to such a small child. Where other Mok'Nathal children played with each other, forming the bonds of friendship and rivalry that would shape their adult lives, young Rexxar preferred the company of animals. He would spend hours in the forests surrounding the village, observing the creatures that lived there, learning their habits and behaviors. He watched how they hunted, how they communicated, how they formed their own societies and hierarchies. The animals, in turn, seemed to sense something in him, a kindred spirit, perhaps, a being who understood them in ways that most of the so-called intelligent races could not. They did not flee from his approach as they did from others. Birds would land on his outstretched arms. Small mammals would curl up in his lap. Even predators, creatures that should have seen the young half-breed as prey, treated him with a curious respect. The elders of the village noticed this ability and recognized it for what it was. The gift of the beastmaster was rare, but not unknown among the Mok'Nathal. It appeared perhaps once in a generation, a natural affinity for animal life that went beyond simple training or domestication. Those who possessed it could form bonds with beasts that others could not, could communicate in ways that transcended the limitations of language. They began to teach Rexxar the old ways, the techniques that had been passed down through generations of Mok'Nathal beastmasters. They showed him how to approach wild animals without threatening them, how to read their body language and respond appropriately, how to offer his friendship without demanding submission. The boy learned quickly, his natural talent amplified by disciplined training. Leoroxx watched his son's development with a mixture of pride and concern. The boy's abilities were remarkable, unprecedented even among the beastmasters of legend. But his restless nature worried the chieftain. Rexxar chafed under the restrictions of village life, constantly pushing at the boundaries that had been established for his safety. As he grew older, Rexxar began questioning the pacifist philosophy that his father held so dear. Why should the Mok'Nathal hide from the world? Why should they spend their lives cowering in a hidden village while the rest of Draenor lived and fought and built empires? Why should they not seek their place among the other peoples of Draenor, proving that half-breeds were the equal of any pure-blooded orc or ogre? The father tried to explain to his son the wisdom of isolation. The world beyond their village was cruel and unforgiving, filled with those who would see the half-breeds as monsters or slaves. The peace they had found in Gorgrond was precious, hard-won, and easily lost. To venture out into that world was to invite the suffering that the clan had worked so hard to escape. Leoroxx spoke to his son of the Bladespire ogres, of the generations of servitude that the Mok'Nathal had endured. He described the horrors of the gladiatorial pits, the casual cruelty of masters who saw half-breeds as less than animals. He told Rexxar about warriors he had known, friends who had tried to make their way in the outside world and had paid the ultimate price for their ambition. The chieftain also spoke of his own experiences in the wider world, of the prejudice he had encountered even among those who claimed to be allies. He told Rexxar about the subtle disrespect, the way that orcs and ogres alike looked at half-breeds with contempt barely hidden behind polite words. The world saw the Mok'Nathal as mongrels, as abominations, as useful tools at best and worthless refuse at worst. But Rexxar could not accept this reasoning. He was young and strong, filled with the fire of youth that sees no obstacle as insurmountable. The prejudice his father described seemed like a challenge to be overcome, not a barrier to avoid. Surely, if he proved himself in battle, if he demonstrated that a Mok'Nathal could be the equal of any warrior, the world would have to acknowledge his worth. The idea of spending his entire life in hiding, never testing himself against the challenges of the wider world, was intolerable to him. He looked at his father and saw a great warrior reduced to leading a handful of refugees in a forgotten corner of the world. Was this really the best that a Mok'Nathal could hope for? Was this all that their future held? He wanted to prove himself, to find his place among warriors, to become something more than just another half-breed hiding in the wilderness. He wanted glory and recognition, wanted the world to know his name, wanted to carve out a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. These were the dreams of youth, perhaps naive, but powerful in their simplicity. The tension between father and son grew as Rexxar approached adulthood. Their arguments became more frequent and more heated, each conversation ending with bitter words and wounded pride. Leoroxx saw in his son's eyes the same restlessness that had doomed so many young warriors to early graves. He recognized the signs because he had seen them before in the faces of Mok'Nathal who had left the village and never returned. He tried to channel that energy into productive pursuits, teaching Rexxar the ways of the beastmaster, hoping that a deeper connection to the natural world would satisfy his wanderlust. If the boy could find meaning in his gift, could understand that being a beastmaster was a calling in itself, perhaps he would not feel the need to seek validation from the outside world. In this, at least, the father succeeded beyond his expectations. Rexxar proved to be a natural beastmaster, perhaps the most gifted the clan had ever produced. He could communicate with animals in ways that bordered on the supernatural, forming bonds that went beyond mere training or domestication. The beasts he befriended became extensions of himself, loyal companions who would follow him into any danger. But the very skills that Leoroxx hoped would keep his son close to home only made him more capable of leaving. A warrior who could call upon the beasts of the wild as allies needed no army at his back, no clan to support him. Rexxar could survive anywhere, thrive anywhere, and he knew it. The wilderness that his father saw as dangerous, Rexxar saw as home. The physical changes of adulthood only emphasized Rexxar's exceptional nature. He grew to a height of over 8 feet, towering over even the largest pure-blooded orcs. His musculature was massive, the ogre blood in his veins giving him strength that few could match. His shoulders were broad enough to bear burdens that would crush lesser beings, his arms thick with muscle that rippled beneath skin the color of weathered leather. His legs, developed from years of running alongside his animal companions, could carry him at speeds that seemed impossible for someone of his size. He could cover distances in a day that would take other travelers 3 or 4, his endurance seemingly inexhaustible. The forests of Gorgrond had no secrets from him. He knew every path, every stream, every cave where a hunter might find shelter from the storms that swept across the land. He took to wearing the skulls and bones of great beasts he had hunted, trophies that spoke of his prowess without the need for words. A massive skull decorated his shoulder, the remains of a predator that had made the mistake of attacking him and paid the ultimate price for its aggression. Smaller bones adorned his armor, each one a memory of a hunt, a battle, a triumph over the dangers of the wild. His face, a blend of orcish and ogreish features, was fierce and intimidating. His jaw was heavy, his brow pronounced, his eyes deep-set, burning with an intensity that unsettled those who met his gaze. Yet those who looked closely might see something else in those eyes, a loneliness perhaps, a yearning for something he could not name. For all his strength and skill, Rexxar was incomplete, searching for a purpose that the quiet life of the village could not provide. He carried twin axes, weapons that he had crafted himself under the guidance of the village smiths. The blades were perfectly balanced, designed to be thrown or wielded in close combat with equal effectiveness. In his hands, they were extensions of his will, instruments of destruction that had claimed the lives of countless beasts, and on rare occasions, the bandits and raiders who sometimes ventured too close to Mok'Nathal territory. Rexxar began to wander further and further from the village, spending days or weeks at a time in the wilderness. These journeys started as hunting trips, expeditions to bring back food and materials for the clan. But they became something more, explorations of a world that called to him with a voice his father could not hear. During these wanderings, he encountered the other peoples of Draenor from a distance. He watched orc hunting parties as they tracked game across the plains. He observed ogre caravans as they traveled between settlements. He saw Gron, the massive elemental creatures that claimed dominion over the mountains. Each encounter deepened his curiosity about the world beyond the village, his desire to be part of something larger than the small community that had raised him. His father knew that each departure might be his son's last, that one day Rexxar would leave and not return. Leoroxx watched from the edge of the village as his son disappeared into the forests, wondering if this would be the time when the wilderness finally claimed him, or worse, when the outside world would seduce him away from everything the chieftain had tried to build. He could only hope that when that day came, his son would find whatever it was he was searching for, and perhaps, if the spirits were kind, he might eventually find his way back home. The moment of decision came when the Horde arose on Draenor. This was not the honorable organization that would later be rebuilt under Thrall's leadership, but a savage army corrupted by fell magic and bent on conquest. The Orcish clans, once proud and independent, had been manipulated by the warlock Gul'dan into drinking the blood of the demon Manaroth, binding themselves to the Burning Legion's will. Under War Chief Blackhand, a puppet ruler controlled by the Shadow Council, the Orcs had united as never before. Their blood curse drove them to violence against any who stood in their way, transforming what had been a collection of hunter-gatherer societies into the most fearsome military force Draenor had ever seen. The Draenei, peaceful settlers who had lived on Draenor for thousands of years, became the first victims of this transformed horde, their cities burned and their people slaughtered in an orgy of violence that stained the Red Land even redder. Word of the Horde's rise spread across Draenor, reaching even the remote village of the Mok'Nathal. Leoroxx listened to the reports with growing concern. He recognized the signs of demonic corruption, had heard stories of such things from the elders who remembered the days before the Bladespire enslavement. The orcs were not acting of their own will. They were being used, manipulated by forces that cared nothing for their well-being. Blackhand needed soldiers, and he was not particular about where they came from. He sent emissaries to the ogre clans and to the Mok'Nathal, offering them a place in the Horde. The emissaries spoke of glory and conquest, of a new order that would reshape the world. They promised land and wealth, power and prestige, everything that might tempt those who felt marginalized by the existing order. The ogres, drawn by promises of conquest and plunder, were quick to accept. They saw in the Horde an opportunity to reclaim the dominance they had lost, to become masters rather than subjects. Clan after clan joined the swelling army, adding their strength to the force that was preparing to march across worlds. But the Mok'Nathal, under Leoroxx's leadership, refused. The chieftain had fought too long and suffered too much to trade one form of servitude for another. He recognized that the Horde's promises were hollow, that those who joined would be used as cannon fodder, expended in battles that served the interests of those who pulled the strings. His people wanted no part of the Horde's wars, no matter what rewards were promised. Rexxar disagreed with his father's decision. He saw in the Horde an opportunity, a chance to prove himself on a stage larger than anything Gorgrond could offer. Where Leoroxx saw corruption and manipulation, Rexxar saw only strength and purpose. The Horde had direction. They were going somewhere, doing something, while the Mok'Nathal hid in their remote village and waited for the world to pass them by. The young warrior was impressed by what he had heard of the Horde's warriors, by stories of their ferocity in battle and their unshakable loyalty to one another. This was the brotherhood he had been seeking, the belonging that village life had never provided. Among the Horde, he could prove his worth, could show that a Mok'Nathal was the equal of any pure-blooded orc. The argument between father and son was the worst they had ever had. They faced each other in the center of the village, their voices raised loud enough for every Mok'Nathal to hear. Leoroxx pleaded with Rexxar to see reason, to understand that the Horde's path led only to destruction. He spoke of the corruption he sensed in the orcish army, of the demonic taint that drove their bloodlust. But Rexxar was young and proud, convinced that he knew better than his father. The life of caution and isolation that Leoroxx preached seemed like cowardice to the young warrior. He wanted to test himself against the challenges of the world, to prove that a Mok'Nathal could stand among the greatest warriors of any race. He announced his intention to join the Horde, to leave the village and seek his fortune among the warriors who were reshaping Draenor. The declaration hung in the air between them, irreversible as a blade once drawn from its sheath. Rexxar saw the pain in his father's eyes, but refused to acknowledge it. To show weakness now would be to lose the argument entirely. Leoroxx could have forbidden it. As chieftain, he had the authority to command any member of the clan, to order his son confined to the village until this madness passed. But he knew that trying to hold Rexxar by force would only drive him away faster and with more bitterness. A caged beast only grows more desperate to escape. Instead, the father gave his son a choice: join the Horde and be disowned, cut off from the clan forever, or stay and accept the life that had been chosen for him. It was an ultimatum born of desperation, a final attempt to make Rexxar understand the gravity of his decision. Leoroxx hoped that faced with such a stark choice, his son would see reason. Rexxar chose to leave. The word fell like a stone into still water, its ripples spreading outward to touch every member of the gathered clan. A son had rejected his father. A warrior had turned his back on his people. Nothing would ever be the same. The parting was cold and final. Leoroxx watched his son walk away, his massive form growing smaller with each step until he disappeared into the forests that surrounded the village. The chieftain had lost many things in his long life, had seen friends and family die in the wars against the Bladespire ogres, but this loss was different. This was not death, which was final and absolute. This was a son who had chosen to abandon everything his father had built, to reject the wisdom that Leoroxx had tried so hard to impart. Other members of the clan came to comfort their chieftain, but Leoroxx waved them away. This was a wound that comfort could not heal, a sorrow that words could not address. He turned and walked back to his home, to sit alone with his grief and wonder where he had failed. Rexxar did not look back. Whatever pain he felt at leaving his family, his home, his people, he buried deep inside and focused on the path ahead. He would not give his father the satisfaction of seeing him waver. He had made his choice, and he would live with the consequences. That was the Mok'Nathal way, if not the path his father had wanted for him. In the years to come, Rexxar would sometimes wonder if he had made the right decision. In the darkest moments of his wandering, when loneliness pressed in from all sides, he would think of the village he had left behind and wonder what might have been different if he had stayed. But such thoughts were weakness, and he pushed them away with the same determination that had carried him out of Gorgrond and into the wider world. With the young warrior went his most loyal companion, a large black wolf named Haratha. The story of their meeting had become something of a legend in the village, a tale that the elders told to illustrate the depth of Rexxar's gift. Rexxar had found Haratha as a pup, abandoned by its pack after its mother was killed by a predator. The young wolf was starving, barely clinging to life, too weak to even growl at the massive figure that approached it. Any other hunter would have seen the pup as useless, too far gone to be worth saving. But Rexxar looked into those dying eyes and saw something that called to him. He had carried the pup back to the village in his massive arms, had stayed awake for 3 days and nights nursing it back to health. The elders had told him he was wasting his time, that the wolf would die despite his efforts. But Rexxar refused to give up, feeding the pup drops of milk and water, keeping it warm against his own body when the nights turned cold. Against all odds, Haratha survived. More than survived, he thrived. The wolf grew into a magnificent beast, larger than any of his kind, fierce and intelligent in ways that seemed almost supernatural. His fur was black as midnight, his eyes gleaming with an awareness that went beyond animal instinct. He was devoted to Rexxar with an intensity that bordered on the fanatical, seeing in the half-breed not a master, but a brother. Where Rexxar went, Haratha followed. When Rexxar slept, Haratha kept watch. When danger threatened, Haratha was there before Rexxar even knew to be afraid. The bond between them was deeper than any leash or training could create, a connection of souls that transcended the boundaries between species. And so together, the beastmaster and his wolf made their way to join the Horde. The journey took them through some of the most dangerous territories on Draenor, but Rexxar and Haratha navigated them with ease. They crossed the Blade's Edge Mountains, skirting the territories of hostile Gron and ogre clans. They traversed the jungles of Tanaan, avoiding the predators that lurked in the shadows. They crossed rivers and climbed cliffs, always moving toward the gathering point where the Horde was assembling its forces. Rexxar's skills, honed through years of wandering in the wilderness, served him well. He could read the land like others read books, sensing danger before it appeared, finding safe paths through seemingly impassable terrain. Haratha's keen senses complemented his own, the wolf detecting threats that even the beastmaster might have missed. When Rexxar finally reached the Horde, he was accepted immediately. His size and strength made him a valuable warrior, towering over even the largest orcs. His abilities as a beastmaster were rare enough to be prized, and the commanders recognized that a warrior who could call upon the beast of the wild as allies was worth a dozen ordinary soldiers. He was assigned to various units as the Horde prepared for its greatest undertaking, the invasion of Azeroth through the Dark Portal. The armies were massive, tens of thousands of orcs and their allies preparing to march through a gateway between worlds. The scale of it was unlike anything Rexxar had imagined, far beyond the small skirmishes and hunting expeditions of his youth. The Dark Portal itself was a wonder and a horror in equal measure. Created through the darkest of magics, it stood as a gateway between worlds, a bridge across the void that separated Draenor from Azeroth. The portal crackled with energy that Rexxar could feel in his bones, a wrongness that spoke of powers beyond mortal comprehension. But the Horde marched through without hesitation, and Rexxar marched with them. He passed through alongside thousands of other warriors, stepping from one world into another, leaving behind everything he had ever known. The transition was disorienting, a moment of absolute darkness followed by blinding light as he emerged on the other side. When his vision cleared, he found himself standing on alien soil beneath an alien sky, surrounded by the armies of a world he had never imagined. Azeroth was unlike anything Rexxar had experienced. The world was green and lush where Draenor had been harsh and barren. Trees grew tall and straight here, their leaves of vibrant green that seemed almost unnatural to eyes accustomed to the muted colors of his homeland. The air was different, richer somehow, carrying scents of flowers and growing things that Rexxar could not identify. The light was different too, softer and more golden than the harsh brightness of Draenor's red sun. Even the sounds of the wilderness were foreign to his ears, bird calls and animal noises that he had never encountered before. Haratha stood close beside him, the wolf's ears pricked forward, taking in this strange new world with the same mixture of wariness and curiosity that Rexxar felt. But the beastmaster adapted quickly, as he always had. Within days, he had begun to learn the patterns of Azeroth's wildlife, to recognize the calls of its birds and the tracks of its beasts. Within weeks, the forests of this new world felt almost as familiar as the wilds of Gorgrond. His gift for understanding animals transcended the boundaries between worlds. The creatures of Azeroth responded to him just as the creatures of Draenor had. Haratha, too, adapted to this new environment. The wolf proved to be an excellent hunter in Azeroth's forests, his black coat blending perfectly with the shadows beneath the trees. He learned to track the local prey animals, learned which predators to avoid and which to challenge. Together, the Beastmaster and his companion explored their new home, even as they fought in the war that had brought them here. The wars that followed were brutal beyond anything Rexxar had imagined. The first war saw the destruction of Stormwind, the great human city falling before the onslaught of the Horde. Rexxar witnessed the burning of countless villages, the slaughter of soldiers and civilians alike. The bloodlust that drove the orcs spared no one, not women, not children, not those who surrendered and begged for mercy. At first, Rexxar participated in these atrocities without question. This was war, after all, and in war the enemy must be destroyed. The humans were obstacles to be removed, nothing more. Their screams and pleas meant nothing to a warrior focused on victory. But gradually, doubt began to creep into his mind. The humans he killed were not so different from the Mok'Nathal, families trying to protect their homes, warriors fighting for their people. They died just as his own kind died, with fear and pain and desperate hope for something beyond this world. Was this really the glory he had sought when he left his father's village? The Second War was even larger in scale, pitting the Horde against an alliance of human kingdoms, dwarves, high elves, and gnomes. The battlefields stretched across continents, and Rexxar fought in many of them. His axes claimed lives without number, each kill adding to a tally that he had long since stopped counting. Haratha fought beside him, the wolf's jaws as deadly as any weapon. He was assigned to fight alongside Grom Hellscream and the Warsong clan, some of the fiercest warriors in the Horde. Grom was a legend among the orcs, a berserker whose fury in battle was unmatched. His war cry, the terrifying scream that gave him his name, could turn the tide of battles single-handedly, striking fear into the hearts of enemies and inspiring his own warriors to impossible feats of valor. Rexxar learned much from fighting alongside such warriors. He watched how Grom led from the front, never asking his soldiers to face dangers he would not face himself. He saw how the war song fought as a unit, each warrior supporting those around him, their coordination making them far more effective than their numbers would suggest. But he also began to see aspects of the Horde that troubled him. The bloodlust that drove the orcs was not natural. Rexxar could see it in their eyes, a burning red glow that intensified when battle was joined. He could smell it in their sweat, a chemical wrongness that spoke of corruption at the deepest level. He could hear it in their battle cries, an edge of madness that went beyond warriors' fury. The orcs killed not from necessity, but from an insatiable hunger for violence, a need that could never be satisfied, no matter how many enemies fell before them. After battles, when the fighting was done and normal warriors would rest, the orcs prowled the killing fields like predators, seeking more prey. They mutilated bodies, tortured prisoners, committed acts of cruelty that served no tactical purpose. This was not the warrior's path that Rexxar had sought. This was not the brotherhood he had hoped to find. This was madness wearing the mask of war, and Rexxar began to understand that his father had been right about the Horde all along. The Mok'Nathal had not drunk the blood of Manaroth. Rexxar's mind was unclouded by the demonic taint that drove the orcs to ever greater extremes of violence. He could see what they could not, that they were being used, manipulated, driven like beasts toward goals that served powers beyond their understanding. But what could he do? He had left his people, had burned his bridges with his father, had committed himself to the Horde's cause. To desert now would be to admit that everything he had done was wrong, that his father's wisdom was greater than his own pride. So he continued to fight, continued to kill, pushing his doubts deep down where they could not interfere with his duty. Gul'dan's betrayal during the Second War only confirmed Rexxar's growing suspicions about the true nature of the Horde's leadership. The warlock, who had done so much to corrupt the Orcish race, who had been instrumental in creating the blood curse that drove them to madness, abandoned the Horde at a crucial moment to pursue his own schemes. At the height of the war, when the Horde needed every warrior, Gul'dan led his followers away to search for the tomb of Sargeras, an ancient vault that supposedly contained the remains of a fallen god. He cared nothing for the orcs who died because of his absence, nothing for the war that his people had sacrificed everything to fight. He cared only for power, and when he found it, it destroyed him. His death in the tomb of Sargeras was fitting, torn apart by demons that he had thought to command. But the damage he had done lived on in every orc who bore the blood curse he had helped to create. The stain of his corruption would take generations to wash away, if it could ever be removed at all. The Horde was defeated in the Second War, driven back through the dark portal to Draenor. The alliance of Lordaeron pursued them, intent on ending the orcish threat once and for all. Rexxar returned to his homeworld briefly, but what he found there offered no comfort. Draenor was dying. The wars had ravaged the land, and the fell magic that the warlocks had used had corrupted the very earth itself. Where once there had been forests and plains, now there was only wasteland. The sky was darkened by clouds of Eshish and demonic energy. The world that Rexxar remembered from his youth was almost unrecognizable. The clans were fractured, leaderless, broken by their defeat. Those who had survived the wars on Azeroth found themselves scattered across a dying world, struggling to survive in conditions that grew worse by the day. The unity that had made the Horde so powerful was gone, replaced by infighting and desperation. Ner'zhul, the elder shaman who had taken control in the aftermath of Gul'dan's death, was no improvement over his predecessor. Where Gul'dan had been power-hungry and treacherous, Ner'zhul was desperate and reckless. He had seen the doom that approached and sought escape at any cost, even if that cost was the destruction of everything they had built. Ner'zhul launched a campaign to gather powerful artifacts from Azeroth, magical items that would allow him to open portals to other worlds. His plan was to give the orcs new lands to conquer, new peoples to subjugate, new worlds to consume. It was the same madness that had defined the Horde since its corruption, the same cycle of destruction that had already claimed one world. Rexxar wanted no part of it. He had seen where this path led, had watched as the Horde's bloodlust had destroyed everything it touched. He had no desire to carry that destruction to yet another world, to repeat the same mistakes on an even grander scale. But he was still a warrior of the Horde, still bound by the oaths he had sworn when he left his father's village. Desertion meant death, and even if he could escape the punishment that awaited traitors, where would he go? Draenor was dying. Azeroth was enemy territory. There was nowhere in any world for a half-breed who had thrown away everything else. He was stationed with Grom Hellscream and the Warsong clan on the Azerothian side of the Dark Portal, tasked with guarding the gateway, while Ner'zhul's forces searched for the artifacts they needed. It was a duty that kept him away from the worst of what was happening on Draenor, but it could not keep him safe from what was to come. The destruction of Draenor was felt even on Azeroth. When Ner'zhul opened his portals, the magical energies tore the dying world apart. The ground shook even on the other side of the portal. The sky darkened as the gateway flickered and surged with power. And then, with a final cataclysmic release of energy, the dark portal collapsed. The gateway that had connected the two worlds was destroyed, stranding all those on the Azerothian side, including Rexxar and the Warsong clan. They were cut off from their homeworld forever, trapped on a planet that hated them, surrounded by enemies who would show no mercy to the invaders who had caused so much destruction. But it was not the destruction of his homeworld that broke Rexxar's spirit. It was not the knowledge that his father and his people might have perished in the cataclysm. It was what happened shortly after, in a moment that would change his life forever. The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones and made even the hardiest warrior seek shelter. The stars above were strange, unfamiliar constellations that reminded Rexxar with every glance that he was far from home, far from everything he had known before the wars began. Rexxar was camped with a small group of orcs, remnants of the Warsong who had been scattered by the recent chaos. The Dark Portal's destruction had thrown everything into disarray, and survival had replaced strategy as the primary concern. They were in a remote valley, hidden from the human patrols that now hunted the remaining orcs with ruthless efficiency. Haratha lay beside him, the wolf's warmth a comfort in the darkness. The black wolf had curled around Rexxar's back, his body heat cutting through the chill of the night. Even in sleep, the wolf remained alert, one ear twitching at every sound, ready to wake at the first sign of danger. In those quiet moments, Rexxar often reflected on the years they had spent together. Haratha had been his constant companion through everything. The training years in Gorgrond, the decision to leave his father's village, the march through the dark portal, the brutal campaigns of the First and Second Wars. Through victory and defeat, through glory and shame, the wolf had never wavered. They were attacked without warning, not by humans or dwarves, but by their own kind. An orc warlock, one of the few who had survived Gul'dan's disastrous expedition to the tomb of Sargeras, had grown desperate for power. The fell magic that had once flowed freely through the Horde's sorcerers was fading, and those addicted to its dark energies would do anything to feed their hunger. He had been watching Rexxar for days, had seen the bond between the beastmaster and his wolf, had recognized the power that flowed between them. In his corrupted mind, he saw not a warrior and his companion, but a source of energy waiting to be harvested. The wolf's life force, so intimately connected to the half-breed's own power, would make an excellent sacrifice for his dark rituals. He struck from the shadows, his fell magic lashing out at Rexxar with enough force to kill. Green fire arced through the night, silent and deadly, aimed at the sleeping beastmaster's heart. Haratha moved faster than thought. The wolf sensed the danger before the attack even fully formed, his supernatural awareness triggering before any mortal reflex could respond. He leapt between Rexxar and the warlock's attack, his black body interposing itself between the spell and his master. The spell that had been meant for the beastmaster struck the wolf instead. Haratha's body absorbed the full force of the life-draining magic, the fell energy tearing through him with merciless efficiency. Years of life were stolen in an instant, the wolf aging decades in the space of a heartbeat. Haratha fell, his body withering before Rexxar's eyes. The magnificent black wolf, who had stood by his side through so many trials, collapsed into a heap of aged flesh and brittle bone. His last breath escaped in a soft whimper, a sound of devotion rather than pain, as if his only regret was that he could no longer protect the master he loved. Rexxar watched his companion die, and felt something inside himself break. The grief that filled him was beyond words, beyond thought, beyond anything he had experienced in his life of hardship and loss. Haratha had been with him since he left the Mok'Nathal Village, had followed him through the dark portal and across 2 worlds, had been his truest and most loyal companion through all the years of war. The wolf had never judged him, never questioned him, never demanded anything except the chance to walk at his side. Now Haratha lay dead, murdered by one of Rexxar's own supposed allies, killed by an orc, a member of the Horde that Rexxar had sacrificed everything to join. The irony was as bitter as any poison. Rage replaced grief, or perhaps merged with it into something darker and more terrible. Rexxar fell upon the warlock with a fury that shocked even himself, a primal violence that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. His axes rose and fell again and again, long after the warlock had stopped moving. The orc's screams faded to silence, but still Rexxar struck, reducing the body to pieces, then reducing the pieces to pulp. When the red haze finally cleared from his vision, there was nothing left of the orc who had killed Haratha, but a bloody smear on the ground. Rexxar stood in the center of the carnage, his arms covered in gore to the elbows, his axes dripping with the warlock's lifeblood. The other orcs in the camp stared at him with a mixture of fear and shock, recognizing in his eyes something that went beyond ordinary rage. Rexxar stood among the remains of his enemy and made a vow. Never again would he trust the so-called civilized races. Not orcs, not humans, not elves, not anyone who walked on two legs and called themselves intelligent. From this day forward, he would trust only beasts, only the animals who had never betrayed him, never lied to him, never murdered his companions for power. He walked away from the camp without a word, leaving behind the orcs who had witnessed his rampage. They did not try to stop him. They had seen the look in his eyes, the look of a being who had been pushed beyond all limits. They knew that any who got in his way would share the warlock's fate. Rexxar wandered into the wilderness of Azeroth, seeking solitude, seeking peace, seeking anything that might fill the void left by Haratha's death. He buried his companion's remains beneath a great oak tree, a spot that overlooked a peaceful valley far from any road or settlement. He marked the grave with stones arranged in the Mok'Nathal fashion and spoke the words of farewell that his people used to honor the passing of great warriors. But the words felt hollow. Haratha had not died in glorious battle against a worthy foe. He had been murdered by a coward, killed by treachery rather than courage. There was no honor in such a death, only waste and tragedy. For days after the burial, Rexxar simply walked. He had no destination, no purpose, no plan. He moved through the forests like a ghost, eating when hunger demanded it, sleeping when exhaustion forced him to stop. The world around him seemed gray and muted, drained of color and meaning by his grief. He did not find peace, not for a long time. The pain of Haratha's loss was a wound that refused to heal, an ache that accompanied him through every waking moment and haunted his dreams at night. He would wake sometimes with the wolf's name on his lips, reaching for a companion who was no longer there. But slowly, gradually, he did find purpose. In the wild, among the beasts who understood him better than any orc or human ever could, he found a reason to keep living. The animals of Azeroth did not care about his grief or his bitterness. They saw only what he was: a predator, a hunter, a being who moved through their world with the same instincts that guided their own lives. The years that followed were years of wandering. Rexxar traveled across Azeroth, never staying in one place for long, avoiding civilization whenever possible. He crossed the mountains of Khaz Moden, scaling peaks that no orc had ever climbed. He traversed the forests of Ashenvale, learning to move through the night elf territory without being detected. He wandered the deserts of Tanaris and the swamps of Dustwallow, the plains of Mulgore, and the jungles of Stranglethorn. Each region taught him something new, added to his knowledge of the world and its creatures. He learned which plants were poisonous and which were medicinal, which animals could be befriended, and which were too territorial to approach. He discovered hidden valleys and forgotten caves, places where no civilized being had set foot in centuries. His philosophy became simple: trust beasts, not people. Animals did not betray. They did not lie. They did not murder their companions for power or abandon their friends for personal gain. A predator might kill you, but it did so openly, honestly, following the laws of nature that governed all life. The worst that a beast could do was follow its nature, and there was no evil in that. Only the so-called civilized races were capable of true cruelty, of choosing to cause suffering when other options were available. They killed not from hunger or fear, but from hatred, greed, ambition. They betrayed those who trusted them, manipulated those who loved them, destroyed everything they touched in their endless pursuit of power. Rexxar wanted no part of that world. He had tried to be a part of it, had believed that he could find belonging among the Horde. But the Horde had shown him what civilization truly meant. Death and betrayal, corruption and loss. He was done with all of it. This philosophy served Rexxar well in the wilderness. He became legendary among those who glimpsed him, a giant of a warrior who moved through the wild places with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. Hunters told stories of a half-breed who could vanish into the forest like smoke, who could track any prey across any terrain, who spoke to animals as if they were his kin. He was seen with various animal companions, creatures who should have been wild and dangerous, but who walked beside him with the calm trust of domesticated pets. Hawks perched on his shoulder, wolves trotted at his heels, bears followed him like devoted hounds. He was always alone, but never truly solitary, always accompanied by the beasts who had become his only friends. It was during his wanderings in the region of Feralis that Rexxar found the companion who would become most closely associated with him. The forests of Feralis were ancient and wild, home to bears and wolves and great cats that ruled the shadows beneath the canopy. It was a place where the civilized world had little influence, where nature still held sway over all who entered. At the ruins of Ravenwind, a crumbling complex that spoke of civilizations long fallen, Rexxar came upon a terrible scene. A mother bear lay dead, her body torn by wounds that suggested a violent attack from multiple assailants. Harpy feathers were scattered across the ground, and the tracks around the clearing told a story of a desperate battle. The mother bear had fought to protect her cub. She had taken on attackers that outnumbered her, had fought even when the wounds became too numerous to survive. She had died as a mother should, defending her child with every last breath. And beside her, a small cub was crying for a mother who would never answer. The tiny creature pawed at the still form, making sounds of distress that cut through Rexxar's hardened heart like a blade. The cub was too young to understand death, too young to comprehend that it was now alone in a world that cared nothing for orphans. Rexxar looked at the cub and saw himself. Here was another creature alone in a hostile world, abandoned through no fault of its own. The mother bear had loved her child, had given everything to protect it, but love was not always enough. Sometimes the world was simply too cruel, too indifferent to the bonds that tied living things together. The beastmaster could have walked away. He could have left the cub to the mercy of the wilderness that had claimed its mother, could have let nature take its course. A cub this young would not survive long on its own. Within days, it would join its mother in death. That was the way of the wild, and Rexxar knew it better than most. Instead, he knelt down and gently gathered the small creature into his massive arms. The cub struggled briefly, terrified of this giant being, but Rexxar's hands were gentle and his voice was soft. He made the sounds that bears use to comfort their young, sounds he had learned from years of observing and befriending the creatures of the wild. Slowly, the cub's struggles ceased. It looked up at Rexxar with eyes that held a world of confusion and fear, but also a spark of something else. Hope, perhaps, or simply the desperate need for warmth and safety that all young creatures share. He named her Misha, and from that moment forward, they were never apart. Rexxar raised the cub as he had once, raised Haratha, feeding her with meat that he hunted and fish that he caught in the streams of Feralis. He protected her from predators who saw an easy meal, stood guard while she slept, carried her when the distances were too great for her small legs to cover. He taught her the ways of survival in the wild, the same lessons he had learned from a lifetime of wandering. Misha grew quickly, as bears do. Within months, she had transformed from a helpless cub into a young bear capable of hunting on her own. Within a year, she was powerful enough to defend herself against most predators. Within a few years, she had grown into a magnificent brown bear, easily the largest Rexxar had ever encountered, powerful and fierce when danger threatened. But with Rexxar, she was gentle. The half-breed who had saved her life was not her master, but her family, the only parent she had ever truly known. She followed him not from training or compulsion, but from love, from a bond that had formed in those first terrible moments among the ruins of Ravenwind and had only grown stronger with each passing day. The bond between Rexxar and Misha was different from what he had shared with Haratha. The wolf had been a companion of his youth, a friend who had known him before the wars had changed him. Haratha had seen Rexxar as a young warrior, full of hope and ambition, had watched as that hope turned to disillusionment and then to grief. Misha was a companion of his wandering years, a friend who knew only the solitary beastmaster he had become. She had never seen him in the Horde's armies, never witnessed the violence and betrayal that had driven him from civilization. To her, Rexxar was simply the being who had saved her, who cared for her, who loved her without condition or expectation. In some ways, that made their bond stronger. There was no nostalgia to complicate it, no memories of better times that might make the present seem diminished by comparison. There was only the present, the eternal now of the wilderness, the simple joy of two beings moving through the world together. As the years passed, Rexxar gathered other animal companions. Spirit was a hawk he found injured in the barrens, her wing broken by an arrow that some careless hunter had fired. He nursed her back to health over the course of a season, setting the bone and keeping her fed until she could fly again. When the time came for her to leave, she chose instead to stay, her eyes that could spot prey from miles away becoming invaluable for hunting and scouting. Huffer was a fierce boar who challenged Rexxar for dominance in a forest clearing, only to be defeated and then spared. The boar had expected death, had braced himself for the killing blow that any other victor would have delivered. Instead, Rexxar had offered food and friendship, and Huffer had become a loyal companion who would charge into battle without fear, his tusks as deadly as any blade. Leoroxx was a wyvern, a young one, who had been separated from his pack during a storm. The creature was injured and disoriented, easy prey for the predators that roamed the mountains. Rexxar found him and nursed him back to health, and when Leoroxx's wings healed, he chose to remain with the beastmaster rather than return to his own kind. His wings could carry Rexxar across vast distances, making journeys of weeks into journeys of days. Each creature came to him in its own way, drawn by his reputation or simply by the connection that all beasts seemed to feel with this strange half-breed warrior. He collected them like others might collect treasures, each one precious, each one irreplaceable. But Misha was always first among his companions, always the one who stayed closest to his side. When Rexxar traveled through the dangerous territories of the Barrens, Misha walked beside him. When he camped beneath the stars, Misha lay across his feet, her warmth a comfort against the chill of the night. When danger threatened, Misha was the first to rise in his defense, her roar a warning to any who would harm her friend. She was more than a pet, more than a companion. She was family, the only family he had left, and he would die before he let any harm come to her. The Beastmaster's wanderings eventually brought him to the regions of central Kalimdor, where the orcs had established a new nation after their escape from the eastern kingdoms. Rexxar avoided the settlements, wanting nothing to do with his former people, but circumstance has a way of drawing even the most reluctant heroes back into the affairs of the world. The dying grunt's name was Mogren, and he lay in a pool of his own blood when Rexxar found him. The orc had been ambushed by human raiders, his patrol wiped out in a battle that had left him mortally wounded. With his last breaths, he begged Rexxar to carry a message to Orgrimmar, to warn War Chief Thrall of the danger that threatened the young nation. Rexxar could have refused. The affairs of orcs were no longer his concern. He had left the Horde years ago, had sworn never to involve himself in their wars and politics again. But something in Mogren's eyes reminded him of Haratha in those final moments, that look of desperate hope that maybe somehow his death would mean something. He took the message and carried it to Orgrimmar. The city that Rexxar entered was unlike anything the old Horde had built. Orgrimmar was not a war camp or a temporary settlement, but a true city, constructed with care and intended to last. The orcs who lived there were not the bloodthirsty berserkers he remembered from the Second War, but farmers and craftsmen, families trying to build a new life in a land that was finally their own. And at the center of it all was Thrall, war chief of the Horde. Rexxar had heard stories of Thrall during his years of wandering, tales of an orc raised by humans who had somehow freed his people from their internment camps and led them to a new homeland. The Beastmaster had dismissed those stories as propaganda, exaggerations meant to inspire loyalty among the common orcs. But meeting Thrall in person, he began to understand that the stories might be true. Thrall was not like the war chiefs Rexxar had known. There was wisdom in his eyes, compassion even, qualities that seemed almost alien in an orc leader. He listened to Mogren's message with genuine concern, thanking Rexxar for bringing it and offering the hospitality of Orgrimmar in return. The Beastmaster should have left then. He had delivered the message, fulfilled his promise to the dying grunt. There was nothing keeping him in Orgrimmar, nothing but curiosity about this strange new horde and the equally strange war chief who led it. He stayed. In the days that followed, Rexxar learned more about what Thrall had built. This was not the corrupt, demon-tainted horde of Blackhand and Gul'dan. This was something new, an organization dedicated to honor and survival rather than conquest and destruction. The orcs were trying to shake off the legacy of their cursed past, to become something better than what they had been. Thrall schooled the Beastmaster in the attitudes of this reformed horde, explaining the philosophy that guided their actions. They did not seek war with the humans, though they would defend themselves if attacked. They did not desire conquest, only a place to call their own. They wanted to live in peace with the other races of Azeroth, if such a thing were possible. Rexxar was skeptical at first. He had seen too much betrayal, too much cruelty from the Horde to trust easily. But the more time he spent in Orgrimmar, the more he came to believe that Thrall was sincere. This war chief was different from those who had come before. This Horde was different. Maybe things really could change. His decision to stay was cemented when he met two other warriors who would become his closest allies. Rokon was a troll shadow hunter, a scout from the Darkspear tribe who had joined the Horde during their journey to Kalimdor. Chen Stormstout was a Pandaren brewmaster, a traveler from distant lands who had befriended Thrall during the founding of Durotar. These three, along with Rexxar and his beast companions, would become an unlikely fellowship. The half-ogre who trusted no one, the troll who served as Thrall's eyes and ears, and the Pandaren who wandered the world in search of new experiences. Together, they would face the greatest threat the young nation had yet encountered. Admiral Dalen Proudmoore was a legend among the humans of Azeroth. He had led the navy of Kul Tiras with distinction for decades, winning countless battles against pirates, monsters, and during the Second War, the Orcish Horde. His hatred for the orcs was legendary as well, born from the death of his son Derek during the Great Naval Battle near the island of Crestfall. When Dalen learned that his daughter Jaina had allied with the orcs of Thrall's Horde, he was horrified. The admiral could not understand how any human could trust the green-skinned monsters who had caused so much suffering. He sailed to Kalimdor with a fleet of warships, determined to destroy the Horde once and for all, and if necessary, to drag his daughter back to civilization. Jaina tried to reason with her father. She explained that Thrall's Horde was different from the one that had destroyed Stormwind and killed so many humans. She told him about the demon corruption that had driven the orcs to their atrocities, about how they were trying to build a new society based on honor rather than bloodshed. But Dalen would not listen. In his eyes, the only good orc was a dead orc. The admiral's forces attacked without warning, catching the young nation of Durotar unprepared. Human ships blockaded the coast, while soldiers landed to strike at orcish settlements. The attacks were brutal and effective, exploiting the fact that the orcs had focused their resources on building rather than defense. Thrall knew that the Horde could not survive a prolonged war against Proudmoore's forces. Their numbers were too few, their resources too limited. They needed allies, needed to strengthen their position before the humans could crush them entirely. He turned to Rexxar, the half-breed warrior who had proven himself worthy of trust, and asked him to serve as the Horde's champion in the conflict to come. Rexxar accepted the responsibility. Whatever doubts he still harbored about the Horde were outweighed by his respect for Thrall and his hatred for what Proudmoore represented. The Admiral was another example of the civilized races at their worst, someone who let hatred blind him to reason, who would destroy everything rather than accept that his enemies might be capable of change. The first task that Thrall set for his champion was to unite the various factions of the region under the Horde's banner. The Stonemaul ogres, who lived in the marshes of Dustwallow, were a potential ally if they could be convinced to join the cause. Their strength would be valuable in the battles to come, and their knowledge of the local terrain could prove crucial. But the Stone Maul were led by Korgal, a brutal chieftain who cared nothing for alliances or diplomacy. He ruled through fear and violence, crushing any who challenged his authority. To convince the Stone Maul to join the Horde, Rexxar would have to defeat Korgal in single combat and claim leadership of the clan for himself. The challenge was issued and accepted. Korgal was confident in his strength, certain that no half-breed could match a true ogre in battle. He was wrong. The fight was brutal and bloody, as fights between powerful warriors always are. Korgal was strong, stronger than almost any opponent Rexxar had faced. But the beastmaster was faster, smarter, and he had allies that the ogre chieftain had not considered. Misha fought alongside her, master, as did his other beast companions. Together, they overwhelmed Korgal's defenses and brought the mighty ogre down. With Korgal's death, Rexxar became chieftain of the Stone Maul ogres. He had no desire for the position, no interest in ruling over anyone, but he understood its necessity. He led the Stone Maul back to Tidefury Cove, where Thrall was assembling the forces of the Horde for the coming battle. It was there that Thrall named Rexxar champion of the Horde, giving him the honor of leading the assault against Admiral Proudmoore's forces. The title meant little to the Beastmaster himself, but it meant a great deal to the orcs and their allies. Here was someone who had proven himself in battle, someone they could follow into the fires of war. The campaign against Proudmoore was fought across the shores and islands of Dustwallow Marsh. Rexxar led his forces with a tactical brilliance that surprised those who had dismissed him as merely a savage. He understood the terrain, understood the strengths and weaknesses of both his own forces and his enemies, understood how to use every advantage that presented itself. Battle after battle went to the Horde. Proudmoore's soldiers, for all their discipline and equipment, could not match warriors who were fighting for their homes and families. The Admiral's forces were pushed back, their strongholds falling one by one, until only Theramore itself remained. Theramore was Jaina's city, the settlement she had built for the humans who had followed her to Kalimdor. It had also become her father's final stronghold, the place where the Admiral had concentrated his remaining forces for a last stand. Attacking the city meant risking the lives of innocents, of humans who had done nothing wrong except follow a leader whose hatred had led them to this moment. Thrall hesitated to order the assault. He had no desire to harm Jaina or her people, no wish to become the monster that Proudmoore believed him to be. But the Admiral would not negotiate, would not surrender, would not accept anything less than the complete destruction of the Horde. There was no choice but to attack. Jaina made one last attempt to stop the bloodshed. She confronted her father, begging him to stand down, to see reason, to understand that the orcs were not the enemies he believed them to be. Dalen refused. He called his daughter a traitor, a fool who had been deceived by monsters. He would not rest until every orc in Durotar was dead, even if it cost him his own life. The assault on Theramore began at dawn. Thrall sent his foot soldiers to engage the bulk of Proudmoore's forces, while Rexxar and his companions slipped through the chaos to find the Admiral himself. It was a desperate gamble, but if they could defeat Proudmoore, the war might end without further bloodshed. they found the admiral on the walls of his citadel, surrounded by his most loyal retainers. He was old, but still strong, still dangerous, still filled with the hatred that had driven him across the sea to this moment. He saw Rexxar approaching and laughed, a bitter sound that held no joy. This was it, then, the monster who would finally kill him. The admiral drew his sword and prepared to meet his end as a warrior should, fighting to his last breath. The battle was fierce. Proudmoore was a veteran of countless conflicts, and his skills had not diminished with age. His retainers were equally capable, elite soldiers who had served the admiral for years. But Rexxar had Misha, had Rokon, had Chen. He had the strength of the Mok'Nathal and the cunning of a lifetime spent in the wilderness. In the end, the admiral fell. His last sight was of Rexxar standing over him, axes dripping with blood, the face of the enemy he had spent his life fighting. He died as he had lived, consumed by hatred, unable to see the possibility of peace, even in his final moments. Jaina wept for her father, despite everything he had done. Rexxar understood her grief, even if he could not share it. The admiral had been many things, some of them terrible, but he had also been a father who, in his own twisted way, had been trying to protect his daughter. The line between love and madness is sometimes very thin. With Proudmoore's death, the war ended. The remaining human soldiers surrendered or fled, and Theramore passed fully into Jaina's hands. She would rule the city in peace, maintaining a fragile alliance with the Horde that would persist through many trials in the years to come. Thrall offered Rexxar whatever reward he wished: land, titles, a position of honor in the Horde's leadership. But the beastmaster wanted none of these things. He had fought for Durotar because it was the right thing to do, not for personal gain. Now that the fighting was over, he wanted only to return to the wilderness that had always been his true home. But before he left, he made a promise to Thrall. If the Horde ever needed him again, if Durotar ever faced a threat that required his strength, he would return. The title of champion might mean nothing to him personally, but the responsibility it represented was one he would not abandon. The years that followed were peaceful, at least by Rexxar's standards. He wandered the wilds of Kalimdor, his path running from the Stone-Talon Mountains through Desolace to Feralus. The route was one he had traced many times before, a circuit that took him through some of the most beautiful and dangerous terrain on the continent. In the Stone-Talon Mountains, he climbed the peaks where harpies nested, where the wind howled through canyons with a voice that sounded almost alive. He helped the Tauren of Sunrock retreat when they faced threats too great for their numbers to handle, though he never stayed long enough to become entangled in their affairs. Through Desolace he traveled, that blasted land where little grew and less survived. Even in that harsh environment, Rexxar found beauty, the stark majesty of the Kodo graveyard, where the great beasts went to die, the haunting stillness of Thunder Axe Fortress, the unexpected oases where life persisted despite everything. In Feralus, he returned again and again to the place where he had found Misha, to the ruins of Ravenwind, where a cub had cried for its mother. The harpy colony that had killed the mother bear had learned to fear the half-breed who walked with the massive brown bear. They gave him a wide berth now, understanding that to threaten him was to invite destruction. He avoided civilization when he could, seeking out the wild places where he could live according to his own rules, accompanied only by Misha and his other beast companions. The world of the civilized races held nothing for him. He had seen what they were capable of, had experienced their betrayals firsthand. In the wilderness, at least, he knew what to expect. Word of his deeds had spread, and he was recognized wherever he went. The orcs of Durotar spoke of him with reverence, the champion who had saved their nation in its hour of need. They told stories of his battle against Korgal, of his leading the charge against Admiral Proudmoore, of his tactical genius that had won battles thought unwinnable. The humans who knew of him had other names, less flattering ones. To them, he was the beast who had killed their admiral, the monster who had helped the orcs establish their foothold in Kalimdor. But Rexxar paid no attention to what others called him. He knew who he was, and that was enough. Rokaro, a younger orc who had served under Rexxar during the war, took on the duties of champion in his absence. He was stationed at Shadowprey Village in Desolace, handling the day-to-day responsibilities that Rexxar had no interest in. The political negotiations, the diplomatic missions, the endless meetings that were necessary to maintain the Horde's position in the region. All of these fell to Rokaro, while Rexxar wandered free. It was a good arrangement. The Horde had a representative in the region, someone who could speak for the interests of their scattered outposts. And Rexxar was free to live as he chose, to follow the path of the wilderness wherever it might lead. But the past has a way of reaching out to those who try to escape it. No matter how far one runs, no matter how deeply one buries the memories, some things cannot be outrun. When the dark portal reopened during the Burning Crusade, connecting Azeroth once again to the shattered remains of Draenor, Rexxar could not ignore the call. He had spent years trying not to think about his homeland, about his father and his people. He had told himself that they were gone, that the cataclysm had surely claimed them as it had claimed so much else. But now the portal was open, and on the other side lay the answer to questions he had never dared to ask. Somewhere in the ruins of his homeworld was the truth about what had happened to those he had left behind. Was his father still alive? Had the Mok'Nathal survived? Or had Leoroxx's philosophy of isolation proved as doomed as Rexxar had always secretly feared? He had to know. Even if the answers were painful, even if the journey brought nothing but grief, he had to know. He stepped through the portal and into Outland, the broken realm that had once been Draenor. The transition was as disorienting as it had been the first time, but the world he emerged into was nothing like the one he remembered. Draenor was gone. In its place was something that could barely be called a world at all. Fragments of land floating in an endless void, connected by bridges of rock and magic that seemed to defy the laws of nature. The sky was wrong, filled with swirling energies that hurt to look at. The air was thin and strange, carrying scents of corruption and decay. The Blade's Edge Mountains, where his people had lived, were still recognizable, but barely. The gentle slopes he remembered from his youth were now jagged spires of rock, thrust upward by the cataclysm that had torn the world apart. The forests were gone, replaced by barren wastes where nothing grew. The land itself seemed wounded, crying out in silent agony for what it had lost. To his surprise, Rexxar found that the Mok'Nathal had survived. Mok'Nathal Village still existed in the eastern reaches of the Blade's Edge Mountains, a small settlement of half-breeds who had somehow endured the destruction of their world. The village was different from what he remembered, rebuilt from the rubble of what had been destroyed, but it was unmistakably his people's work. And leading them, older now but still strong, was his father Leoroxx. The chieftain who had disowned his son so many years ago was still alive, still guiding his people through whatever trials the universe had thrown at them. The reunion between father and son was complicated. Years of separation had not healed the wounds of their parting. If anything, time had allowed those wounds to fester, to become infected with bitterness and recrimination. When Rexxar walked into Mok'Nathal Village, the other half-breeds stared at him with a mixture of awe and suspicion. They had heard stories of the prodigal son, the warrior who had left to join the Horde and never returned. Some saw him as a legend, others saw him as a traitor. All of them watched to see how Leoroxx would react. The chieftain emerged from his home when word reached him that his son had returned. He was older now, his hair turned gray, his face lined with the worries of decades. But his eyes were still sharp, still piercing, still capable of making Rexxar feel like a child being called to account for his mistakes. Leoroxx looked at his son for a long moment, taking in the changes that time had wrought. Rexxar was larger than he remembered, more weathered, with scars that spoke of battles survived and companions lost. Misha stood beside him, the massive bear who had become as much a part of Rexxar as his own shadow. The chieftain's first words were not ones of welcome. "So, you finally remembered that you have a family." Rexxar felt the old anger rising, but forced it down. He had not come all this way to fight. "I came to see if you survived. I came to see if the Mok'Nathal still existed." "We exist," Leoroxx said flatly. "No thanks to those who abandoned us." It was an accusation, a condemnation, a summary of everything that had gone wrong between them. Rexxar could have responded in kind, could have pointed out that he had left because his father gave him no choice. But he was tired of fighting, tired of carrying the weight of that old anger. "I made mistakes," he said instead. "I'm not the same person who left." "No," Leoroxx agreed, looking at the bear beside his son. "You found new family, I see. New people to replace the ones you left behind." The words stung as they were meant to, but Rexxar did not rise to the bait. He simply stood and waited, letting his father work through whatever emotions the reunion had stirred. The conversations that followed were difficult. Leoroxx was still bitter about Rexxar's decision to join the Horde, still convinced that his son had made the wrong choice. He pointed to the destruction of Draenor as evidence of what the Horde had wrought, as proof that Rexxar had sided with monsters. Rexxar countered that the Mok'Nathal's isolation had nearly led to their extinction, that if they had built alliances with the other races of Draenor, they might have been better prepared for the disasters that followed. Ner'zhul's portals had not discriminated between those who had joined the Horde and those who had not. The destruction had claimed everyone, regardless of their political affiliations. They argued as they always had. Their voices rose and fell in the rhythms of a debate that had been going on for decades, each side marshaling the same arguments, reaching the same impasse. Neither was entirely wrong, and neither was entirely right. The truth lay somewhere in between, in the gray areas that both of them found difficult to acknowledge. Rexxar had been right that isolation was not sustainable, that the Mok'Nathal needed connections to the wider world. Leoroxx had been right that the Horde was corrupt, that its wars had brought destruction to everyone they touched. Perhaps if they had both been willing to listen, they might have found common ground. Perhaps if Rexxar had stayed, had tried to change the village from within rather than leaving, things might have been different. Perhaps if Leoroxx had been less rigid, less convinced of his own wisdom, he might have found a way to keep his son close. But the past was the past. All they could do now was decide what to do with the future. Despite their differences, Rexxar chose to stay in Outland for a time. He stationed himself at Thunderlord Stronghold, a Horde outpost in the Blade's Edge Mountains. The outpost was close enough to Mok'Nathal Village that he could visit when he wished, but far enough that he was not directly challenging his father's authority. From Thunderlord's stronghold, he protected the region from the threats that plagued it. The Grahn were particularly dangerous, massive creatures that combined the worst aspects of ogres with elemental fury. These primordial beings had ruled the mountains since time immemorial and resented any encroachment on what they considered their territory. Rexxar hunted them with a determination that bordered on obsession. The Grahn were worthy opponents, creatures that could match his strength and test his skills. Each hunt was a battle, each victory a reminder that he was still capable of doing something worthwhile. The ogres were another threat, tribes that had survived the cataclysm and now preyed on anything weaker than themselves. Rexxar dealt with them as he dealt with all threats, swiftly, efficiently, without mercy for those who showed none to others. Through his efforts, the region became safer. The Mok'Nathal could venture further from their village without fear. The Horde's outposts could operate without constant harassment. Even the Alliance expeditions that passed through the area benefited from the reduced threat level, though Rexxar took no joy in helping his former enemies. But he could not avoid his father forever. Eventually, after months of circling each other, father and son had to speak again. The conversation happened late one night, when Rexxar returned to the village to bring supplies he had gathered during his hunts. They sat together by a fire, two warriors who had lived long lives and learned hard lessons. Leoroxx spoke of the cataclysm, of the terror and confusion when the portals had torn the world apart. He spoke of the struggle to survive in a land that had become hostile to all life, of the sacrifices that had been necessary to keep the Mok'Nathal from extinction. Rexxar listened without interrupting, hearing for the first time what his father had endured during the years of their separation. He had imagined many times what might have happened to his people, but imagination could not capture the full horror of what they had survived. When Leoroxx finished, Rexxar spoke of his own journey. He told his father about Haratha, about the wars and the betrayals, about the years of wandering that had followed. He spoke of Misha and the other companions who had become his family, of Thrall and the reformed Horde, of the battle against Proudmoore, and the title of champion that he had never sought. It was not a reconciliation, not yet. The wounds were too deep, the history too painful for a single conversation to heal. But it was a beginning. They acknowledged for the first time that both of them had suffered, both of them had made mistakes, both of them had done the best they could with the choices available to them. They were both still alive, both still capable of change. Perhaps given enough time, they might find a way to bridge the gap that separated them. The years continued to pass, marked by conflicts that drew Rexxar back into service time and again. He had returned to Azeroth after his time in Outland, resuming his wandering ways while remaining ready to answer the Horde's call when needed. When Garrosh Hellscream, son of Grom, rose to become war chief, Rexxar felt a chill of recognition. Garrosh had the same fire that his father had possessed, the same fury and pride. But where Grom had eventually found redemption, Garrosh seemed to embrace the darkness that the blood curse had awakened in the orcish soul. The siege of Orgrimmar, when Garrosh's own people rose against him, reminded Rexxar of why he had left the Horde so many years ago. The organization he had fought for, that Thrall had tried to build into something honorable, had been corrupted from within by a leader who cared only for power and conquest. The fourth war between the Alliance and Horde was even worse. Sylvanas Windrunner, the Dark Lady who had become war chief after Garrosh and his successor Vol'jin, led the Horde down a path of destruction that made even the old Horde's atrocities seem measured by comparison. The burning of Teldrassil haunted Rexxar's dreams. He had not been present for the destruction of the World Tree, but he had heard the accounts, had seen the refugees who had escaped the flames, an entire civilization, ancient and beautiful, reduced to ash in a single act of calculated cruelty. This was not war. This was madness, the same madness that had driven the Horde in its earliest days, the same corruption that had led to so much suffering. The beastmaster wondered if Thrall's dream had ever truly been possible, or if the Horde was simply destined to repeat the same cycle of violence forever. The war brought atrocities on both sides. The Alliance was not innocent. Their forces committed acts that no honorable warrior could justify. But the Horde's leadership seemed determined to embrace the worst aspects of their heritage, to become the monsters that their enemies had always claimed they were. Rexxar fought when he had to, defended those who needed defending, but he took no joy in the conflict. The young warrior who had left his father's village seeking glory would not have recognized the weary veteran who now trudged through battlefields littered with the dead. When the war finally ended, when Sylvanas was overthrown and her schemes exposed, the Horde was left broken and exhausted. The organization that had weathered so many crises, that had survived the fall of war chiefs and the destruction of worlds, seemed to have finally reached its breaking point. A new Horde council had been established to replace the position of war chief, a recognition that no single leader could be trusted with absolute power. Representatives from each of the Horde's member races would share responsibility for governance, would make decisions together, rather than placing the fate of millions in the hands of one individual. It was a good change, Rexxar thought. Perhaps if such a system had existed from the beginning, many of the Horde's worst mistakes could have been avoided. But he was too old and too cynical to believe that any system was proof against the ambitions of the corrupt. The council asked Rexxar to undertake a journey across Kalimdor to assess the state of the Horde's territories and report on what was needed to heal the wounds of war. It was a mission of mercy rather than conflict, a chance to see the damage that had been done and to begin the long process of repair. He was accompanied on this journey by Zekon, a young troll who had risen to prominence during the Fourth War. Zekon had fought with distinction against Sylvanas' forces, had shown courage and integrity at a time when both were in short supply. The council believed that pairing him with the legendary champion would help establish his credentials among the Horde's diverse populations. Zekon was idealistic and earnest. Everything that Rexxar had once been before the world had taught him to be cynical. The young troll believed in the Horde, believed that it could be something noble and good, believed that the future would be better than the past. The old warrior found himself oddly protective of this youngster, wanting to shield him from the disillusionments that surely lay ahead. Zekon's optimism was precious precisely because it was so fragile. A few more years of war and betrayal would crush it, would turn him into the same bitter wanderer that Rexxar had become. They traveled across the vast reaches of Kalimdor, visiting settlements and outposts, listening to the concerns of common people who had suffered through years of conflict. In Orgrimmar, they heard from orcs who had lost family members in the war, who struggled to rebuild lives that had been shattered by forces beyond their control. In Thunder Bluff, they spoke with Tauren elders who remembered when the land had been peaceful before the endless conflicts had scarred every region of the continent. The troll settlements were particularly poignant. The Darkspear had suffered much in the war, had lost their beloved Vol'jin to wounds sustained on the broken shore. Zekon had known the old Shadow Hunter, had fought alongside him in those final battles. Speaking with the elders brought back memories that the young troll had tried to bury. Rexxar watched as Zekon processed his grief, recognizing the signs of a soul coming to terms with loss. The young troll was learning what the old warrior already knew, that attachment led to pain, that love always ended in loss, that the only constants in life were the wilderness and the beasts who shared it. But he did not try to harden Zekon's heart as his own had been hardened. Perhaps the young troll would find a different path, would learn to love without being destroyed when that love was taken away. Perhaps the future truly could be different from the past. The journey showed them both the best and worst of what the Horde had become. They saw communities that had come together in the face of adversity, that had set aside old grudges to help one another survive. They also saw places where the war had left wounds that might never heal, where hatred and suspicion had replaced the fragile trust that Thrall had worked so hard to build. Rexxar dutifully reported what he saw to the council, offering his assessments without sugarcoating the difficulties that lay ahead. The Horde would survive, he believed. It had survived worse. But recovery would take time, patience, and a commitment to the principles that Thrall had established. Whether the current leadership had such commitment remained to be seen. Their journey eventually brought them to a place that held special meaning for Rexxar. Years ago, before he had found Misha, before he had even joined the Horde, during those dark days after Haratha's death, when he wandered Azeroth seeking peace he could not find, he had had another wolf companion named Huelo. Huelo had been a young wolf when Rexxar found her, fierce and wild, but willing to accept the half-breed's friendship. They had traveled together for several years, hunting and surviving in the wilderness that had become Rexxar's home. When Huelo died, of old age rather than violence, Rexxar had buried her in a remote corner of Kalimdor and had not returned in decades. He took Zekon to the grave, wanting to share something of his past with this young troll who had become something like a friend. The grave was overgrown now. The stones that Rexxar had placed to mark it half buried in vegetation. But he remembered exactly where it was, could never forget the spot where he had laid another companion to rest. They held a small ceremony, a Mok'Nathal farewell to a companion long gone. Rexxar spoke the words in his native tongue, the language that his father had taught him before everything went wrong between them. He spoke of Huelo, of the years they had spent together, of the loyalty that the wolf had shown until the very end. Zekon listened in respectful silence, understanding that this was important to the old warrior, even if he could not fully appreciate why. The young troll had lost companions of his own, had buried friends who had fallen in the war. He knew something of what Rexxar felt, though he could not know the full depth of it. "You carry many ghosts," Zekon said softly when the ceremony was finished. Rexxar nodded. "We all do, in the end. The ones who survive carry the memories of those who don't." He was learning that there was more to Rexxar than the legend suggested, that beneath the gruff exterior was someone who felt things deeply, who had loved and lost and somehow found the strength to continue. The champion of the Horde was not just a warrior. He was a being who had been wounded by life and had chosen to keep moving forward despite the pain. Their journey eventually led them to the Harg festival, a celebration of Orcish heritage that was being held on Azeroth for the first time. The Harg had been a tradition on Draenor, a time when the clans would set aside their differences and come together in peace to celebrate their shared culture. It had been lost during the years of corruption, but now, with the Horde trying to rebuild itself, Thrall had called for its revival. Rexxar was surprised to receive an invitation from Thrall himself. The former war chief had remembered the half-breed who had served the Horde so faithfully, who had saved Durotar in its darkest hour. Thrall understood, perhaps better than anyone, the value of bringing together those who had been scattered by war and circumstance. Even more surprising was the news that Leoroxx had agreed to attend. The chieftain of the Mok'Nathal had spent most of his life avoiding the gatherings of other races, had built his philosophy around the idea that isolation was the only path to safety. For him to make the journey from Outland to Azeroth, to participate in an event organized by the Horde, represented a profound change in his thinking. Perhaps the years had taught him wisdom that stubbornness had denied. Perhaps the near extinction of his people had shown him that isolation was not the answer after all. Or perhaps, like Rexxar, he simply wanted to see his son one more time while there was still time to see him. The festival was held at Razor Hill, not far from Orgrimmar. The settlement had been transformed for the occasion, decorated with banners and totems representing all the clans that had ever called themselves Orc. Music filled the air, the drums and horns of a people rediscovering their heritage. The smell of cooking meat wafted from dozens of fires, a feast being prepared for the thousands who had gathered. Orcs had come from across Azeroth and Outland, representing every clan and faction that still claimed Orcish blood. There were Frostwolves and War Songs, Blackrocks and Bleeding Hollows, Mag'har from Outland, and Orcs who had been born on Azeroth and had never seen their ancestral homeland. They came to celebrate their culture and history in ways that had been impossible during the years of war and corruption. It was a chance to remember who they had been before the Blood Curse, before Gul'dan and Blackhand, and all the horrors that had followed. The shamans spoke of the elements and the ancestors. The storytellers recited tales of ancient heroes. The warriors demonstrated their skills in friendly competitions that had no stakes beyond honor and respect. Rexxar found his father among the gathered Mok'Nathal, a small contingent who had made the long journey from Outland. There were perhaps 24 of them, all that remained of a people who had once numbered in the hundreds. They stood apart from the other groups, as they always had, but they were here. That alone was remarkable. Leoroxx looked older than Rexxar remembered, older even than he had appeared during their last meeting in Outland. His hair had gone completely white, his face deeply lined with the weight of years. He moved more slowly than he once had. The strength that had killed Imperator Kelgrog now faded to a shadow of what it had been, but his eyes were still sharp. They found Rexxar across the crowded gathering space and held him with the same intensity they had always possessed. There was something different in them now, though, something softer than the bitterness that had characterized their previous meetings. Father and son walked toward each other through the crowd, two warriors who had been at war with each other for longer than many of those present had been alive. The other Mok'Nathal watched with held breath, wondering what would happen when they finally stood face to face. Leoroxx spoke first. "My son." Just those two words, but they carried the weight of decades. "Father?" Rexxar's voice was rough with emotions he had not expected to feel. They spoke not as enemies or rivals, but as father and son. The conversation was halting at first, neither quite sure how to navigate the gulf that lay between them. But gradually, as the hours passed and the festival continued around them, the words came easier. Leoroxx admitted that he had been wrong to disown Rexxar. His pride had cost him years that he could never get back, years when he could have known his son, could have watched him become the warrior and leader that he had become. The philosophy of isolation that he had clung to so tightly had been born of fear, not wisdom, and fear had made him push away the one person he should have held closest. Rexxar, in turn, acknowledged that his father had been right about many things. The Horde had not been what he had hoped it would be. The corruption and violence that Leoroxx had warned about had been real, had caused suffering beyond anything the young Rexxar could have imagined. If he had listened to his father's counsel, if he had found some way to bridge the gap between them rather than storming away in anger, perhaps things would have been different. The reconciliation was not complete, probably would never be complete. Too much had happened, too many years had passed, too many wounds had been inflicted on both sides. The history between them could not be erased with a single conversation, no matter how sincere, but it was enough. They were family again, connected by blood and history, if not always by agreement. They could speak to each other without anger, could stand in each other's presence without the weight of old grievances dragging them down. That was something worth celebrating. During the feast that followed, Rexxar watched the orc champions who were being honored for completing the Amgora, the traditional coming-of-age challenge. Young warriors who had proven themselves worthy, who stood now before their people receiving the recognition that their deeds had earned. He remembered his own youth, the restlessness that had driven him from his father's village, the certainty that he knew better than those who had come before. He had been so sure of himself then, so convinced that the world would bend to his will if only he was strong enough, brave enough, determined enough. How wrong he had been. The world did not bend to anyone's will. It broke those who tried to force it and taught hard lessons to those who survived the breaking. Rexxar had learned those lessons through decades of loss and struggle, through the deaths of companions and the betrayals of allies, through wars that had accomplished nothing and peace that had never truly taken hold. Now he was old, older than he had ever expected to become. The young warrior who had walked out of Mok'Nathal Village so many years ago would not have recognized the scarred and weathered figure he had become. But perhaps that was as it should be. Growth required change, and change was rarely comfortable. He had seen empires rise and fall, had fought in wars that had reshaped the world, had lost companions and found new ones. He had been champion of the Horde and outcast of the Mok'Nathal, wanderer and warrior, beastmaster and legend. He had loved and lost, had trusted and been betrayed, had found moments of peace amid a lifetime of conflict. And through it all, Misha had been at his side. The bear who had started as a frightened cub was now massive and gray-muzzled, showing her age as clearly as Rexxar showed his. Her once brown fur was shot through with gray, her movements slower than they had been in her prime. She slept more now, tired more easily, needed more care than she had when she was young. But her loyalty had never wavered. Her devotion never dimmed. She was the truest friend he had ever known, the companion who had never betrayed him, never abandoned him, never asked for anything except his presence. She had been with him through everything, had seen him at his best and his worst, had loved him regardless of what he did or failed to do. He reached down and scratched behind her ears, a gesture that never failed to produce a contented rumble from the old bear. She leaned into his hand, her eyes half closing in pleasure. The bond between them was beyond words, a connection that had been forged in the worst moment of Misha's life and had only grown stronger with every passing year. Whatever else the future held, they would face it together, as they had faced everything since that day in Feralas, when he had found a cub crying beside its dead mother. They would walk the wild paths until they could walk no more. They would hunt together, sleep together, share the quiet moments of peace that made all the struggle worthwhile. And when the end finally came, as it must come for all living things, they would face it together too. Neither would leave the other alone. That was the promise they had made without words, the covenant that bound them more surely than any oath. The story of Rexxar is a story about belonging, about finding one's place in a world that does not always have room for those who are different. As a half-breed, he was never fully accepted by either of the races from which he descended. Among orcs, he was too ogrish. Among ogres, too orcish. He was always the outsider, always the one who did not quite fit. This sense of not belonging shaped everything about who Rexxar became. It drove him to leave his father's village, seeking acceptance among the Horde that his blood relatives could not provide. It led him to form bonds with animals who did not care about bloodlines or heritage. It made him value loyalty above all other qualities, because he knew from experience how rare true loyalty could be. Many who feel like outsiders respond by trying to change themselves, by forcing themselves into molds that do not fit. Rexxar chose a different path. He accepted who he was, a half-breed, a wanderer, a being who would never fully belong to any society. Rather than fighting against this truth, he embraced it, finding freedom in his isolation rather than pain. But in the wilderness, among the beasts who judged him not by his blood, but by his actions, he found acceptance. The animals did not care that he was Mok'Nathal. They cared only that he treated them with respect, that he understood their ways, that he was willing to live alongside them as an equal rather than a master. The connection between Rexxar and his animal companions goes deeper than the simple bond between a hunter and his hunting dogs. It is a spiritual kinship, a recognition that the distinctions between intelligent and bestial life are not as clear as most assume. The beasts that walk with Rexxar do so because they choose to, because they recognize in him a kindred spirit who shares their values of loyalty, simplicity, and honesty. This is perhaps the greatest lesson of Rexxar's life, that true belonging is not about being the same as those around you, but about finding those who accept you as you are. For Rexxar, those were the beasts of the wild, and later, a select few individuals who proved themselves worthy of his trust. Thrall earned that trust through his integrity, through his commitment to building a horde that valued honor over conquest. Rokon and Chen earned it through shared hardship, through battles fought side by side against common enemies. Zakon earned it through his sincerity, through his willingness to learn, and his refusal to be cynical. These relationships, rare as they were, proved that Rexxar's philosophy of isolation was not absolute. He could trust, could care, could even love in his own way. But the trust had to be earned, had to be proven through action rather than words. Too many times words had betrayed him. Only deeds could truly be believed. His relationship with his father, Leoroxx, illustrates another truth, that family bonds, once broken, are not easily repaired. The years of separation between them left scars that could not be fully healed, even when both were willing to try. The young warrior who left and the old chieftain who let him go were both products of their time, both trapped by pride and fear in ways they could not fully understand. But the attempt at reconciliation was valuable in itself. It was a recognition that love can persist even when it is buried under layers of hurt and misunderstanding. It was an acknowledgement that the past does not have to define the future, that new chapters can be written even when old ones seem to have ended badly. Leoroxx and Rexxar will probably never fully understand each other. Their experiences were too different, their choices too divergent for complete comprehension. But they have learned to respect each other, to acknowledge the validity of the other's path, even when they cannot fully agree with it. That is more than many families ever achieve. The horde that Rexxar eventually came to serve was not perfect. It has committed atrocities, has been led by fools and madmen, has strayed far from the honorable path that Thrall tried to establish. Under Garrosh and Sylvanas, it became everything that Leoroxx had warned it would be, a vehicle for violence and destruction that cared nothing for the people it claimed to serve. But it has also been a home for those who had nowhere else to go, a place where outcasts and exiles could find purpose and belonging. The Tauren found in the Horde an ally against the centaur who had driven them from their lands. The trolls found a protector when the sea witch threatened their very existence. Even the Forsaken, the undead who were shunned by the living world, found acceptance within the Horde's embrace. This duality is part of what makes the Horde worth serving, despite everything. It is an organization capable of great evil, but also great good. The outcome depends on the choices of those who lead it and those who serve it. Rexxar has tried, in his own way, to influence those choices toward the good. Rexxar's title of Champion of the Horde reflects this complexity. He did not earn the title through blind loyalty or unquestioning obedience. He earned it by fighting for what he believed was right, by defending the innocent against those who would destroy them, by being willing to act when action was needed. He has never been a political figure, has never sought power or influence within the Horde's hierarchy. He serves because it is the right thing to do, because there are people who need protection, and he has the strength to provide it. When the Horde strays from the path of honor, he withdraws to the wilderness. When it returns, he returns, too, ready to serve once more. The beasts who accompany him are more than pets or tools. They are partners, friends, family in a way that transcends the boundaries of species. Misha, Spirit, Huffer, Leoroxx, and all the others who have walked or flown or crawled alongside him over the years, these are the relationships that define who Rexxar truly is. Each of these companions has a story, a history, a personality as distinct as any person's. They are not interchangeable animals, but individuals with their own desires, fears, and loyalties. Rexxar knows each of them as intimately as any friend knows another, and they know him in return. This is what it means to be a beastmaster, not to control animals, but to communicate with them, to understand them, to form bonds of mutual trust and respect. The power that Rexxar wields comes not from dominance, but from partnership, from the willingness of his companions to follow him into danger, because they trust him to lead them back out again. In the end, Rexxar's story reminds us that it is possible to find connection even in a world that seems determined to push us away. It is possible to build a family even when the one we were born into cannot accept us. It is possible to find purpose even after everything we believed in has been destroyed. The wounds we carry from the past do not have to define our future. The betrayals we have suffered do not have to close our hearts forever. There is always hope, always the possibility of finding those who will accept us as we are, always the chance to build something beautiful from the wreckage of what was lost. As you drift toward sleep, imagine the wilderness that Rexxar calls home. Picture vast forests where ancient trees stand sentinel over hidden paths, their branches reaching toward the sky like the fingers of giants. The leaves rustle in a breeze that carries the scent of pine and wild flowers, the fragrance of a world untouched by the march of civilization. Imagine mountains that touch the clouds, their peaks dusted with eternal snow that gleams silver in the moonlight. The rock faces are carved by centuries of wind and rain, creating patterns that tell stories older than any written history. Eagles nest in the highest crags, their calls echoing across valleys that have remained unchanged since the world was young. See the rivers that carve their way through the land, carrying the stories of all who have traveled their banks. The water is cold and clear, tumbling over stones smoothed by endless years of flow. Fish swim in the deeper pools, and at night the surface reflects the countless stars that wheel overhead in their eternal dance. In this wilderness, a giant figure moves through the shadows. His footsteps are silent despite his massive size, the result of decades spent learning to walk without disturbing the natural world around him. He reads the signs of the forest as easily as others read books, the bent grass that shows where a deer has passed, the marks on trees that speak of territorial claims, the subtle changes in birdsong that warn of approaching dangers. Beside him walks a bear whose loyalty is absolute, whose devotion spans years beyond counting. Her fur is silver with age now, but her eyes are still bright, still alert, still watching for any threat to the one she loves. When he stops to rest, she curls around him, sharing her warmth as she has since she was a cub. When he rises to continue, she rises too, ready to walk whatever path he chooses. They have walked these paths for decades, have seen seasons change and years pass. They have witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the coming and going of wars, the birth and death of countless creatures who share the wilderness they both love. Through it all, they have remained constant, unchanged in their devotion to each other and to the wild places they call home. They have fought and loved and lost and survived. They have known joy in the simple pleasures of the hunt, in the warmth of sun on fur and skin. They have known grief in the passing of companions, in the destruction of places they once loved. They are still here, still together, still wandering. Perhaps tonight, in your dreams, you will walk alongside them. Perhaps you will feel the soft earth beneath your feet, hear the whisper of wind through leaves, smell the rich scent of forest loam after a gentle rain. Perhaps you will experience, even for a moment, the freedom that comes from belonging nowhere and everywhere, from being at home in every wild place beneath the stars. Perhaps you will feel what Rexxar feels when he looks out over the wild lands that have been his home for so many years. That sense of peace that comes from accepting who you are, from finding your place in the world, from knowing that you are not alone. The knowledge that somewhere out there, others are walking their own paths, seeking their own belonging, finding their own families among those who accept them as they are. The wilderness is waiting as it always has been. It has waited through ages of darkness and ages of light, through the rise and fall of empires, through wars that shook the very foundations of the world. It will wait still, patient, and eternal, ready to welcome any who seek its embrace. The trees do not judge, the mountains do not question, the rivers do not demand explanations for the wounds we carry. The beasts are calling as they always will. Their voices rise in the night, the howl of wolves mourning the moon, the screech of hawks celebrating the hunt, the deep rumble of bears content in their strength. They call to each other across the darkness, and they call to those who understand their language, who share their values of loyalty and honesty, and the simple truth that actions matter more than words. And Rexxar, champion of the Horde, beastmaster of the Mok'Nathal, son of Leoroxx, and friend of Misha, continues his eternal wandering through the wild places of Azeroth. He walks the paths that few others can find, sleeps beneath stars that few others ever see, shares his life with companions that few others could understand. He is at peace now, in his own way, with the life he has built from the wreckage of the life he lost so long ago. If you enjoyed this tale of the Beastmaster and his companions, please like and subscribe to the channel for more stories from the world of Azeroth. Leave a comment with your thoughts on Rexxar, on his relationship with his father, on the beasts who have been his truest friends. Share which moments from his story resonated most with you and whether you think he will ever find the peace he has been seeking for so long. Good night, dear listener. Rest well now, and may your dreams tonight be filled with the wild beauty of untamed places, with the loyalty of true companions, with the knowledge that even the most solitary soul can find belonging in this vast and wondrous world. May you wake refreshed and ready to face whatever challenges await, carrying with you some small piece of the Beastmaster's wisdom, that true strength comes not from fighting alone, but from knowing who to trust. Sleep now. The wilderness will be waiting when you dream.